The tribunal hall of Hearthpoint Nexus was not built for warmth. The walls were gray stone, high and flat, with long narrow lights running across the ceiling that gave everything a pale, washed-out look. The benches in the gallery were hard. The floor was cold. The air carried the faint smell of recycled station oxygen, clean but lifeless, the way all official places smelled when they had been scrubbed of anything human. Or anything alive for that matter. The hall was full today. Soldiers and advisors and observers from a dozen different species filled the rows of the gallery, sitting shoulder to shoulder, their voices low and careful the way voices always got in rooms where decisions were made. Some of them had come because they were required to. Some had come because word had spread through the station corridors the way word always spread, quietly, quickly, and with the particular weight of something that mattered. At the center of the hall, on the open floor below the gallery, a single figure stood. She was tall. Very tall. 7 feet of silver-gray scales that caught the pale ceiling light and gave her a faint metallic sheen. Her wings were folded tight against her back, pressed down and still in the way that draconians held themselves when they were in formal spaces, controlled, composed, giving nothing away. Her tail rested flat against the floor behind her. Her claws, long and dark at the tips, were held loosely at her sides. Her name was Sarah. She was a soldier. Had been one for over 30 years. Her scales carried the marks of it, a long diagonal scar across her left shoulder where shrapnel had caught her during the Drath border conflict. A patch of darker, rougher scale along her ribs where a burn had healed badly in the field. Small things if you knew what to look for. The kind of marks that a career of service left on a body whether you wanted them or not. But she was not here today as a soldier. She was here as a mother. Across from her, seated behind a long flat table of pale stone, were 5 officials. 4 of them were going through papers, speaking quietly to each other, barely looking up. The 5th, the one in the center, the one who mattered, was a man named Aldrich. He was not a large man. He had the look of someone who had spent most of his life sitting at tables like this one, thin at the shoulders, careful in his movements, with small eyes that moved across documents the way a machine reads data. Not unkind exactly. Just empty of the kind of warmth that made a person seem human even when they were. He had a file open in front of him. He read from it without looking up. Your petition requests that your current household military listing remain unchanged, he said. His voice was flat and even like a man reading a grocery list. Specifically that human soldier Ren, identification number 7-7-4 Bravo, continue to be registered under your unit household rather than be reassigned to Battalion 14 as directed under Coalition Efficiency Directive 31. Yes, Sarah said. Her voice was low, steady. He is my son. Aldrich looked up then. Not with any particular expression. Just the mild, slightly tired look of a man who had heard complicated things before and had learned not to be moved by them. He is a human male, Aldrich said. Age 19. You are draconian. There is no biological relationship recorded in any coalition file. I did not say biological, Sarah replied. I said son. A quiet sound moved through the gallery. Not quite a murmur. More like a collective breath, the sound a room makes when something real has been said inside it. Aldrich set his pen down. He folded his hands on the table. And then he explained, in the careful and patient tone of a man who had explained bureaucratic things many times to many people, that the Coalition Efficiency Directive had been passed 4 months ago by a full council vote. It was not personal policy. It was not targeted at anyone. It applied equally across all multi-species household military units throughout Coalition space. The restructuring was designed to simplify command chains, reduce logistical friction, and improve unit cohesion by aligning soldiers with others of their own kind. It was, he said, simply more efficient. Battalion 14 was an excellent posting. Well-resourced. Well-led. Ren would be well-placed there. He would have opportunities. He would be among humans his own age. It was, Aldrich suggested gently, perhaps even better for the young man in the long run. Sarah listened to every word. She did not interrupt. She did not move. She stood on that cold floor and she let him finish every sentence and she gave him the full respect of her attention even as each word landed in her chest like something being slowly taken apart. When Aldrich was done, she was quiet for a moment. The hall was quiet too. She thought about Ren the way she always thought about him when she needed to hold herself together, in small, specific pieces. The way he had looked at 7 years old, covered in dust and dried blood, barely conscious, when she had pulled him out of the rubble of that colony. The way he had reached up with one small hand and grabbed her claw and held on, not knowing what she was, not caring, just holding on because she was there and she was warm and she was not leaving him behind. She thought about the years after. The early ones, when he was small and learning and everything was new and strange, and he would ask her questions about draconian customs with that serious little face of his, trying so hard to understand. She thought about the first time he stood in formation with her unit and held himself straight and did not flinch even though he was the only human in the line and everyone was looking at him. She thought about the night on Station Mireth when she had received the field report and her heart had stopped for 3 full seconds before the next line confirmed he was alive. She thought about all of it in the space of a breath. And then she looked at Aldrich. And she asked, simply, quietly, without anger, without drama, with nothing in her voice except the plain and honest weight of a mother who needed an answer. "Can my son stay with me?" The words came out soft. Softer than anyone in that room expected from a 7-foot draconian soldier with 30 years of service behind her. They were not a legal argument. They were not a counter to his efficiency directive. They were not anything official at all. They were just a question. The kind of question that, once asked in a room full of people, does not leave easily. It settles into the air. It finds the spaces between the procedural language and the filed documents and the careful official voices, and it stays there, quiet and stubborn, like a candle in a room that someone forgot to extinguish. Aldrich opened his mouth. The gallery was completely still. Every soldier, every advisor, every observer on every bench had gone silent without deciding to. Even the officials at the table had stopped shuffling their papers. Aldrich was about to speak. And then, from somewhere near the back of the gallery, a sound cut through the silence. A chair scraped, hard and loud against the stone floor. And someone stood up. Every head in the gallery turned at the same time. The man who had stood was not young. He was somewhere in his late 50s, broad across the shoulders, with short gray hair cropped close to his head and a face that had been weathered by years of things that did not happen in comfortable places. He was not the tallest man in the room. He was not the largest. But there was something about the way he stood, completely still, completely unhurried, with his hands loose at his sides, that made the room feel like it had shifted slightly in his direction. His name was Grant. Retired Commander Grant, formerly of the Coalition's 7th Ground Division, currently listed in the station registry as a senior military advisor attending the tribunal in an observational capacity. He had 3 campaign medals on his chest and a 4th he never wore because he did not like what it reminded him of. He had the kind of face that did not give much away, not cold, not hard, just settled. Like a man who had long ago made peace with most things and had stopped being surprised by the rest. He had not been scheduled to speak today. Aldrich looked at him from across the room with the expression of a man who had just found something unexpected in his paperwork. "Commander Grant," he said carefully, "you are registered as an observer for this tribunal. You do not have the floor." "I know," Grant said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. In a room that quiet, a calm voice carried just fine. "I'll only take a few minutes." Aldrich looked at the other panel members. One of them gave a small shrug. Another looked down at his papers. Aldrich looked back at Grant, pressed his lips together and said nothing, which, in the language of official rooms, meant "go ahead, but I am not happy about it." Grant stepped out of the gallery row and walked slowly down toward the open floor. He did not rush. His footsteps were even and unhurried on the cold stone, and the sound of them was the only sound in the hall as he made his way to the center of the room. He stopped a few feet from where Sarah stood. He did not look at her. He looked at the panel. 3 years ago, he said, there was a breach on Station Mireth. East flank. Enemy units had pushed through a maintenance corridor and cut off the primary evacuation route for a medical bay that had 43 wounded soldiers in it. He paused for just a moment. 11 soldiers were assigned to hold that corridor until a secondary route could be cleared. 10 of them were draconian. 1 of them was human. The gallery was completely still. The breach lasted 6 hours, Grant continued. During those 6 hours the enemy pushed that position 4 separate times. Each push was harder than the last. By the 3rd hour, 3 of the 11 soldiers were wounded and unable to hold a full combat position. He kept his voice flat and factual, the way a man speaks when he has read a report so many times that the facts have become part of him. The human soldier reorganized the line. He moved the wounded to covered positions. He covered the gaps himself. He held the center of that corridor for the last 3 hours of the breach with 2 functioning squad members beside him. He let that sit in the room for a moment. When the secondary route was finally cleared and the evacuation was complete, all 43 wounded soldiers made it out of that medical bay. Grant looked at the panel steadily. All 10 draconian soldiers who held that corridor came home. Pause. Because of what one human boy did for 6 hours on a floor that smelled like smoke and blood while nobody was coming to help him. The gallery made a sound. Low and collective, like wind moving through a space too small to hold it comfortably. That boy, Grant said, was Ren? Sarah did not move. But something in her stillness changed. The kind of change that is not visible exactly, more felt, the way the air in a room changes when a window is open somewhere nearby. Grant reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He produced a small folded document, not handwritten, not personal, just a standard printed copy of something that had been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases had gone soft. He opened it carefully. "I want to read something," he said. "From the Coalition Founding Charter. Chapter 4. Article 9. He found the line and read it in the same even voice he had used for everything else. "Military family unit status shall be determined not by species or biology, but by demonstrated shared service, shared sacrifice, and formal household declaration by a ranking officer of coalition standing." He folded the document again. "Sarah is a ranking officer," he said. "She made a formal household declaration 12 years ago when Ren was 7 years old. It is on record. Ren has served in her unit for 4 years. He has shared service with that unit. He has shared sacrifice with that unit." Grant looked at Aldrich directly. By the Coalition's own founding charter, this petition was not a request. It was a confirmation of something that was already legally established the day Sarah signed those papers. Aldrich's expression had shifted. The blank, processed calm of earlier had been replaced by something tighter, not quite anger, but the particular discomfort of a man who has had his own rulebook used against him in a room full of witnesses. "Commander Grant," he said, and his voice had an edge in it now. "The efficiency directive was passed by full council vote and supersedes previous. It supersedes administrative household groupings for logistical restructuring," Grant said. "It does not supersede founding charter provisions. Those are two different legal categories." He said it the way a man states a simple fact. Without heat. Without argument. Just clearly, so there was no confusion about what he meant. One of the other panel members leaned over and said something quietly to Aldrich. Aldrich listened without taking his eyes off Grant. Grant waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the things that 30 years of service had given him, the ability to stand in an uncomfortable silence without trying to fill it. He just stood there on the cold stone floor with his hands at his sides and let the room work through what he had said at whatever pace it needed. After a moment he spoke again. "I want to say one more thing," he said. "Not legal. Not from any document." The room stayed quiet. "Every species in this hall evolved to protect their own kind," Grant said. "That is natural. That makes sense. Humans do that too." He looked around the gallery slowly, at the draconian soldiers, at the various species filling the rows, at the faces watching him from every angle. "But humans also evolved to do something else. We took in the ones who had no one. We named strangers as family. We built households out of choice instead of blood." His voice stayed level. "It is not a weakness in our nature. It is not a flaw in our design. It is the whole point of us." In the gallery, a large draconian soldier near the back row raised his right fist slowly to his chest, the draconian gesture of acknowledgement. The one used for things that were true and worth recognizing. A few others followed, quietly, without looking at each other. Grant did not acknowledge it. He kept his eyes on the panel. "Ren refused evacuation on that station," he said. "He had a transport available. His extraction officer asked him directly if he was ready to board." Grant's voice was quiet now, quieter than before. He looked at his wounded squad mates on the ground beside him. And he said no. He stayed with them through the night. He kept 2 of them alive until the medical unit arrived in the morning. He stopped. Then he looked at Aldrich and asked, in a voice so calm it was almost gentle, "Which part of that story sounds like a young man who doesn't belong with his family?" The room had no answer. Aldrich found his voice after a moment. His face had gone carefully neutral again, the way official faces do when they are trying to recover composure. "Commander Grant," he said with as much authority as he could put into it, "I am asking you to sit down." Grant looked at him. The room waited. Grant did not sit down. The silence in the room had weight to it now. Not the uncomfortable silence of a room waiting for something to happen. This was a different kind. The kind that comes after something true has been said out loud, when the words are already in the air and everyone in the room knows that what comes next has to be chosen carefully. Aldrich sat with his hands flat on the table. His face was composed, but his eyes were doing the small, fast movements of a man running through options in his head. The other panel members were very still. One of them had stopped pretending to look at his papers entirely. Grant had not moved from the center of the floor. He was not done. "I want to talk about something," he said. His voice was still calm, still unhurried. The voice of a man who had decided before he stood up exactly what he was going to say and was not going to be rushed out of saying it. Not about Ren specifically. Not about this case specifically. He paused. About humans. A few people in the gallery shifted. Not with discomfort exactly. More with the particular attention that comes when a subject gets broader, when a conversation stops being about one person and starts being about something larger. "Every species in this hall," Grant said, looking slowly around the gallery, "evolved with one primary instinct when it comes to family. Protect your own. Your blood. Your kind. Your species." He let that land. That is not a criticism. That is just true. It is how most life in this galaxy is built. You protect what is yours by nature, by birth, by shared biology. He looked back at the panel. "Humans do that too," he said. "We are not different in that way. We protect our families. We protect our children. We protect our own." He paused for just a moment. "But somewhere in our history, very early, long before we had ships or stations or coalition charters, we started doing something else as well." The room was listening. All of it. Even the people who had come in prepared to be bored by another tribunal proceeding were listening now. "We started taking in the ones that did not belong to us," Grant said. "Children whose parents were gone. Strangers who had nothing and no one. People from other villages, other groups, other places who had been left behind by whatever life had done to them." He kept his voice plain and factual. Not emotional. Just clear. "We did not do this occasionally. We did not do this as an exception. We did it so consistently, across so many different human cultures, across so many thousands of years of our history, that it stopped being a choice a long time ago." He let the room sit with that for a second. "It became part of what we are," he said. "When a human sees someone who has been left alone, someone who has no one, someone who has fallen through whatever cracks life has, something in us responds to that. Not with pity exactly. With something older than pity. Something closer to recognition." He paused. "Like the sight of it reminds us of something we already know we are supposed to do." In the gallery, the large draconian soldier who had raised his fist earlier was sitting completely still, his amber eyes fixed on Grant. Beside him, a younger draconian soldier, female with pale green scales, had her head tilted slightly in the draconian way that meant deep attention. She was not blinking. Grant continued. "Every species here evolved to protect their own kind," he said again. "That is their strength. That is what kept them alive across thousands of years of difficult history." He looked around the room slowly. "Humans evolved to protect whoever needed protecting." He said it simply. Not proudly. Not with any performance of greatness. Just as a statement of fact. That is what kept us alive. That is what we brought with us when we came to the stars. Not the biggest ships. Not the most advanced technology. Not the strongest bodies. He stopped. That. The room was very quiet. Aldrich had his hands folded on the table now. He was watching Grant with an expression that was hard to read. Somewhere between official resistance and something more personal that he was working to keep off his face. Grant looked at him. "Ren was 7 years old when Sarah found him," he said. "He had been buried under collapsed structure for several hours. He was dehydrated. He had 2 cracked ribs and a head wound that needed immediate medical attention. He was the only survivor in a 3-block radius." Grant's voice stayed level. He had nothing. He had no one. He was a child in a destroyed place with no one coming for him. He paused. And then someone came for him. The room did not make a sound. "Sarah pulled him out," Grant said. "She carried him to the medical bay herself. She stayed with him through the first night while the medics worked on him because he woke up twice in distress and she did not want him to be alone when he opened his eyes." He kept his eyes on the panel. "She did not do that because she was ordered to. She did not do it because it was efficient. She did not do it because it made logistical sense for a draconian officer to spend her night sitting beside a human child she had found in the rubble an hour before." He stopped. Let the room breathe. "She did it because he needed someone. And she was there." Sarah had not moved through any of this. She was still standing in the same position she had been in since the hearing began, straight, still, wings folded, tail flat. But the hand at her right side had closed slowly into a loose fist. Not with tension. With the effort of holding something in that very much wanted to come out. Grant turned slightly so he was addressing the full room now, not just the panel, not just the gallery, but all of it together. 12 years later, he said, that same child, now a trained coalition soldier, is standing in a breach corridor on Station Mireth. The corridor is the only thing between an enemy advance and 43 wounded soldiers who cannot move themselves to safety. He spoke slowly, clearly. His squad mates are draconian. Every single one of them. He is the only human in that corridor. He has been fighting for 3 hours already. 2 of his squad mates are down. The enemy is pushing again. He paused. A transport becomes available. His extraction officer contacts him directly and tells him there is a way out. Grant looked around the room. And Ren looks at the people on the ground beside him. His squad mates. The soldiers he has trained with, eaten with, served with. The soldiers who are, in every way that matters, his family. A beat. And he says no. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. He stays through the night, Grant said. He keeps 2 of them alive until the medical unit arrives in the morning. He does not sleep. He does not stop. He does not leave. Grant's voice was quiet now, almost gentle, because they needed someone to stay. And he was there. Nobody in the gallery moved. Nobody spoke. Even the air in the room seemed to have gone still, as if the station itself had paused to listen. Grant turned back to the panel. His voice was very calm. Very quiet. The quietest it had been since he started speaking. You are looking at a piece of paper, he said to Aldrich. And that piece of paper says that Ren is human and Sarah is draconian and therefore they cannot be listed as a military household unit because it is not efficient. He let that word sit for just a moment. I have told you what that boy did on Station Mireth. I have told you what Sarah did on that colony 12 years ago. I have told you what they are to each other and what they have been to each other for over a decade. He looked at Aldrich steadily. And I want to ask you something, he said. Not as a legal question. Not as a charter question. Just as a plain and honest question from one person to another. The room waited. Grant's voice did not rise. It did not harden. It stayed exactly as calm and even as it had been from the very first word. Which part of that story sounds like a boy who doesn't belong with his family? The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Aldrich did not answer. Nobody answered. And then from the far end of the panel table, a voice spoke. Sharp and precise and cold in the way that very controlled people are cold when something has gotten under their skin and they are determined not to show it. Commander Grant, the voice said. I have a question for you. Grant turned slowly toward the speaker. It was Advisor Rowan. Advisor Rowan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He was the kind of man whose quietness was its own form of pressure, the kind that builds slowly like water finding cracks in stone. His scales were steel gray, darker than Sarah's silver, and his amber eyes were sharp in the way of someone who had spent decades in rooms like this one and had learned exactly how much damage a well-placed question could do. He leaned forward slightly in his chair. Commander Grant, he said, you have spoken at length about shared sacrifice, about what this boy did on Station Mireth, about what this soldier did on that colony. He paused. You have spoken with a great deal of feeling about all of it. Grant looked at him and waited. My question is simple, Rowan said. Do you have personal history with this unit? The room shifted. It was a small shift, just a change in the quality of the attention, the way a room full of people collectively leans in without actually moving. Everyone had heard the question. Everyone understood what it meant. If Grant had personal history with Sarah's unit, then everything he had said could be reframed not as testimony but as advocacy. Not as fact but as loyalty. It was a clean and efficient way to take apart everything he had built in the last 10 minutes. Rowan knew that. Everyone in the room knew that. Grant was quiet for exactly 1 second. Yes, he said. I do. Another shift in the room. Larger this time. Rowan's expression did not change. But something behind his eyes settled, the way a man looks when a gamble pays off. Then you are not here as an objective observer, he said. You are here as someone with a personal stake in the outcome of this petition. Which means this tribunal should weigh your testimony accordingly. He sat back slightly. Everything you have said should be understood as the words of a man who wants a particular result. Not the words of a neutral witness. It was well done. Clean and precise and difficult to argue with directly. The gallery had gone very still again, but it was a different stillness than before. Tighter. More uncertain. The kind that comes when the momentum of a room changes direction and nobody is quite sure yet where it is going. Grant did not look rattled. He did not look defensive. He looked, if anything, exactly the same as he had looked since the moment he stood up, settled and calm and completely prepared for where this was going. You are right that it is personal, he said. I am not going to argue that. He looked at Rowan steadily. But I want to tell you exactly how personal it is. Because I think when you hear it, you will understand that my being here today is not a conflict of interest. He paused. It is a responsibility. Rowan said nothing, which meant continue. Grant turned slightly so that more of the room could hear him clearly. 20 years ago, he said, I was a field officer assigned to a coalition rescue operation. A human colony on the Outer Rim had been hit in the opening hours of the Drath border conflict. It was a civilian settlement. Mostly families. The attack was fast and it was not discriminate. He kept his voice even. When our units arrived, most of the settlement was gone. We went in expecting survivors. We found very few. The gallery was completely silent. Sarah was part of the coalition response unit assigned to that operation, Grant said. I did not know her well at that point. We had crossed paths briefly during a prior assignment. That was all. He paused. But I watched her work that day for 4 hours in conditions that would have stopped most soldiers cold. He let the room stay quiet for a moment before he continued. She moved through burning wreckage without equipment that should have been mandatory in that environment. She pulled 3 survivors out with her bare hands before the first hour was done. She went back in twice when other soldiers had already marked a section as non-viable. Grant's voice stayed flat and factual. Not decorated. Not emotional. Just clear. The third time she went back in, a secondary structure came down while she was inside. Someone in the gallery made a small sound. It took 12 minutes to get confirmation that she was still alive, Grant said. When she came out, she was carrying a child. The room did not move. A human boy. 7 years old. She had found him buried under 2 meters of collapsed wall in a section that had been marked as cleared. She had gone back because she heard something, or thought she heard something, that nobody else had caught. Grant stopped for just a moment. She dug him out with her hands. When the secondary structure came down, she covered him with her own body and held him against the floor until it was over. He let that image sit in the room. When she came out of that building, he continued, she was bleeding from her left shoulder and she had a burn along her ribs that needed immediate treatment. The medics came to her as soon as she cleared the rubble line. He paused. She would not let them take the boy. She carried him to the medical bay herself. She would not put him down. The silence in the hall had taken on a texture now. Something heavier than just quiet. I was the officer on site that day, Grant said. I filed the initial rescue report. I documented the survivors. I documented the casualties. He looked at Rowan directly. And when Sarah came to me that evening and told me she was not going to leave that boy behind, that she was requesting formal approval to initiate household adoption proceedings, I signed the paperwork. He said it plainly. Without apology. Without justification. I signed it because I had watched her carry him out of a burning building and refused to put him down even when she was bleeding. I signed it because he had no one and she had already decided she was going to be his someone. Grant's voice was quiet. I signed it because it was the right thing to do and I knew it the moment she asked. Rowan had not moved through any of this. His face was still controlled, still careful. But the sharp certainty that had been in his eyes when he asked his question had changed into something harder to name. So yes, Grant said. I have personal history with this unit. I have known Sarah for 20 years. I have known Ren since he was a child who could not yet stand on his own. He looked at Rowan steadily. That is not a conflict of interest. That is 20 years of knowing exactly what I am talking about. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out a single folded piece of paper. Not a document. Not a charter excerpt. Not anything official. Just a piece of plain paper that had been folded and unfolded many times, the creases worn soft with handling, the kind of wear that comes from a letter that has been read more than once by the person who wrote it. Before this tribunal convened, Grant said, Ren wrote a letter. He asked me to read it here if the moment came. He looked at the folded paper in his hand for just a second. I think the moment has come. He unfolded it carefully. The room waited. Grant read it slowly. Not performing it. Not putting weight on the words that were not already there. Just reading it the way it had been written. Simply, quietly, honestly. I know I am not draconian. I know what I look like standing next to my unit. I have known my whole life that I was different from the people who raised me. But I have also known my whole life that different is not the same as not belonging. He paused for a breath and kept reading. I have been asked to describe what Sarah is to me in legal terms. I do not know how to do that. I'm not good with legal terms. So I will just say what is true. Another pause. She came back for me when no one else did. She chose me when she did not have to. She stayed when staying was hard, and she never once made me feel like I was something she had taken on out of obligation. Grant's voice stayed level. Even. I do not know what species makes a mother. I have never known that. But I know what she is to me. He stopped. One more line. Please let me go home. Grant folded the letter. He set it on the panel table in front of Aldrich. Gently. Without ceremony. And then he straightened up and he looked at the room. The hall was completely silent. The kind of silence that is not empty. The kind that is so full of something that there is simply no room left for sound. Aldrich was looking at the folded letter on the table in front of him. He was not reading it. He was just looking at it. The other panel members were still. And Rowan, sharp, precise, controlled Rowan, who had spent decades in rooms like this one and had never once been at a loss, sat at the end of the table with his hands folded and his amber eyes on the floor in front of him. He said nothing. For a long time he said nothing at all. Aldrich looked at the folded letter on the table for a long moment. Then he looked at the other panel members. Then at his papers. Then back at his papers again, the way a man looks when he is trying to find something he already knows is not there. He cleared his throat. The panel will take a short recess to deliberate, he said. His voice had changed. It was still official. Still composed. But the flat certainty that had been in it at the beginning of the hearing, the easy, processed confidence of a man who knew exactly how his day was going to go, was gone. What was left was something more careful. More measured. The voice of a man who was still going to do what he had planned to do, but who was now going to have to work harder to explain why. The panel members stood. They moved through a side door without looking at the gallery. Aldrich was the last to go. He picked up his papers. He did not pick up the letter. He left it on the table where Grant had placed it and walked out without looking at it again. The side door closed behind him. The gallery did not relax. Usually a recess broke the tension in a room. People shifted in their seats. Conversation started up in low voices. The formal stillness of a tribunal dissolved into something more human while the officials were out of sight. That did not happen this time. The soldiers and advisors and observers in the gallery stayed quiet. Some of them looked at the floor. Some looked at the side door the panel had gone through. Some looked at Sarah, who had not moved from the center of the room, still standing, still straight, still with her wings folded and her tail flat and her hands at her sides. Grant walked over to her slowly. He stopped beside her and stood there for a moment without speaking. There was nothing that needed to be said immediately, and he was not the kind of man who filled silence just to fill it. After a moment Sarah spoke. Her voice was low enough that only he could hear it. I have survived 3 wars, she said. I have been wounded more times than I have bothered to count. I have stood in places where I was certain I was not going to come home. She paused. I did not think anything could frighten me the way this does. Grant looked at her. What frightens you about it? Losing him to paperwork, she said. The word came out with a quiet weight behind it. Losing him to an efficiency directive. After everything, after all of it, to lose him to a word on a form. She was quiet for a moment. It feels like the wrong kind of ending. Grant was quiet for a few seconds. Whatever they decide in that room, he said, that boy is your son. He was your son before any paper said so, and he will be your son after any paper tries to say otherwise. He looked at her steadily. That was decided 20 years ago in the rubble of that colony. Everything since then has just been the rest of the world catching up to something that was already true. Sarah did not answer right away. But the tightness in her wings eased slightly. Just slightly. The way a held breath releases when something difficult has been said out loud and found to be bearable. They stood together in the quiet and waited. The side door opened again 20 minutes later. The panel members filed back in and took their seats. Aldrich settled his papers in front of him and looked at the room with the composed, neutral expression of a man who had made a decision and was now going to deliver it in as orderly a fashion as possible. He began to speak. He spoke about legal frameworks first. About the Coalition Efficiency Directive and the Council vote that had passed it and the reasons behind it. He spoke about the importance of consistent policy application across all cases regardless of individual circumstance, because if exceptions were made in one case, the framework that protected everyone became unreliable. He spoke about the difference between what was emotionally compelling and what was legally binding. His voice was even and careful. And with every sentence, the shape of what was coming became clearer. It was a denial. Not a cruel one. Not an indifferent one. He was going to cite Grant's testimony as moving and Commander Grant as a soldier of distinguished service and Sarah as an officer of exemplary record. He was going to say that none of that changed the legal reality of the situation. He was going to approve the transfer of Ren to Battalion 14 with a formal commendation attached to his file and a note that his service record was exceptional. He was going to do it kindly. And it was still going to be a denial. Sarah stood and listened. Her face showed nothing. But her tail had curled slowly inward against her legs, the draconian sign of something being held together by will alone. Grant stood beside her and listened too. His face was still. His hands were loose at his sides. He did not look like a man who was surprised. He looked like a man who had hoped for better and was now making peace with what was actually happening. Aldrich was halfway through his third paragraph when it happened. A hand went up at the far end of the panel table. Slow. Deliberate. Impossible to miss. Aldrich stopped mid-sentence. Every eye in the room went to Advisor Rowan. Rowan had not spoken since Grant had read the letter. He had sat through the recess and returned to his seat and listened to Aldrich begin his carefully constructed denial without any visible reaction. His face had been still. His hands had been folded. He had given nothing away. Now he sat forward in his chair. A point of order, he said. Aldrich's expression tightened. Advisor Rowan, the panel has completed its deliberation. A point of order, Rowan said again. Quietly. Firmly. The way a man speaks when he has decided something and is not going to be redirected. The room was completely still. Aldrich stopped. He looked at Rowan. He looked at the other panel members. None of them said anything. Aldrich pressed his lips together and gave a short, careful nod. Rowan unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table. There is a provision, he said, in draconian military law. It predates the coalition. It predates this station. It predates most of the legal frameworks that currently govern how we define military households and family units. He paused. It is called the Kinbon Declaration. The words landed in the room with a weight that suggested several of the draconian soldiers in the gallery recognized them immediately. The large soldier near the back row had gone very still. The young female beside him with the pale green scales had straightened in her seat. The Kinbon Declaration, Rowan continued, states that any soldier who has bled beside another in active combat, who has shielded another with their own body, and who has been formally named as family by a commanding officer in the field, holds full and permanent household rights with that officer and that unit. He looked at Aldrich directly. Regardless of species. Regardless of biology. Regardless of any administrative restructuring directive passed at any point after the declaration was made. Aldrich opened his mouth. This provision, Rowan said before he could speak, was written into the Coalition Founding Charter as a protected clause submitted by the Draconian Founding Delegation. It sits in Chapter 2. Article 3. He paused. It cannot be overruled by an efficiency directive. It cannot be superseded by administrative policy. It is a founding species provision and it carries founding species authority. The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the station's air system was audible. Aldrich's jaw was tight. Advisor Rowan, the panel's position has already been. The panel's position does not override founding species law, Rowan said. Simply. Cleanly. Without anger. That is not my opinion. That is the structure of the coalition legal framework that this panel operates within. He turned his head and looked at Sarah. For a long moment he just looked at her. His amber eyes were steady. His face was still controlled, but something in it had shifted from the sharp coldness of earlier into something older and more complicated. The look of a man who had spent a long time being certain about something and had recently found reasons to be less certain. You named him in the field, Rowan said to her. You carried him out of a combat zone with your own body. You shielded him. He paused. Under draconian law, that declaration was made the moment you refused to put him down. He looked back at Aldrich. The Kinbon Declaration applies, he said. The petition is valid under founding charter law. It cannot be denied. Aldrich looked at his papers. He looked at the other panel members. He looked at the document in front of him. He looked at Rowan. There was nowhere to go. Every direction he turned, the ground had been taken away. The room waited. Aldrich exhaled slowly through his nose. He straightened his papers. He looked at the room with the composed and slightly exhausted expression of a man who had lost an argument he had been certain he was going to win. The petition, he said quietly, is approved. No one cheered. No one made any sudden sound. Sarah closed her eyes. She stood completely still for a long moment, just breathing. Then she exhaled. One long, slow breath that carried with it the faintest curl of pale smoke from deep in her chest. The kind of breath that only comes when something that has been held for a very long time is finally allowed to release. She pressed her great clawed hand against her chest. Slowly. Gently. The way you press a hand over something precious to make sure it is still there. In the gallery, the large draconian soldier near the back row stood up. He did not say anything. He just stood. Then the young female beside him stood. Then a human soldier 3 rows up. Then 2 more from different species. One by one, without signal, without instruction, without anyone telling them to, the gallery rose to its feet. Soldier by soldier, species by species, row by row, until the entire hall was standing in silence. Nobody spoke. They just stood. The corridor outside the tribunal hall was long and pale and very quiet. After the noise of a room full of people, even a quiet, controlled noise like the kind that filled official places, the corridor felt like a different world entirely. The lights here were warmer than the ones inside the hall. Amber instead of white. The kind of light that made the walls look less like stone and more like something that had been lived in. Ren was sitting on a bench near the far end of the corridor. He had been there for 2 hours. He was not a large young man. 19 years old, lean and straight-backed with short brown hair and the particular stillness of someone who had learned early how to wait without showing what the waiting was doing to them. He was in his service uniform, clean, pressed, correct in every detail, because he had wanted to look right today even though he was not allowed inside. As if being neat on the outside might help somehow with everything that was happening on the inside. His hands were clasped together between his knees. He had been staring at the floor for the last 20 minutes because looking at the tribunal hall door had stopped being something he could do without his chest tightening in a way that was difficult to manage. He heard the door open before he saw it. He looked up. The first person through the door was one of the panel officials, a junior member, already moving quickly toward another corridor with his papers under his arm. Then 2 draconian soldiers from the gallery, speaking quietly to each other. Then a few more people filing out in 1s and 2s, the way crowds always left official rooms, slowly at first, then faster. Ren stood up. He watched the door. And then Sarah walked through it. She was moving at her normal pace, that slow, heavy, deliberate draconian walk that made the floor feel solid beneath her. Her wings were still folded. Her head was up. From a distance she looked exactly the same as she always did, composed, straight, unreadable in the way she had always been unreadable to everyone except him. But Ren had known her for 12 years. He had been reading her face since he was 7 years old. He had learned it the way you learn the face of someone who is your whole world when you are small, completely, without thinking about it, the way you learn a language by living inside it rather than by studying it. He knew every small thing her face did and what every small thing meant. He read her in the first second. His shoulders dropped. Not with defeat, with release. The kind of release that happens in a body that has been holding itself together for a long time and has just been given permission to stop. He let out a breath he felt like he had been holding since morning. Sarah crossed the corridor toward him and she did not stop until she was close. Very close, the way she had always stood with him since he was small, closer than draconians typically stood with anyone outside their family, because he was not outside her family and he never had been. She looked at him for a moment. And then she lowered her head. She brought it down slowly until her brow rested against his, her great silver-scaled head, scarred and warm, pressing gently forward until the contact was made. It was the draconian gesture for the thing that had no single clean translation in human language. The closest was something like "you are mine and I am yours," and that is not something that changes. It was reserved for family. Only ever for family. Draconians did not use it lightly and they did not use it often, and when they used it the meaning of it was not decorative or polite. It meant everything it meant and nothing less. Ren reached up. He placed his hand against the side of her jaw, his fingers against the warm scaled surface of her face, in the exact place he had put his hand since he was 7 years old and barely tall enough to reach. The gesture had started because he was small and it was the part of her he could reach when she held him close. It had stayed because some things become part of how 2 people exist with each other, and stopping feels like losing something that should not be lost. His hand was steadier than he expected it to be. "Well," he said. His voice was quiet, a little rough at the edges. Sarah said nothing. She did not need to. He had already read the answer in her face when she walked through the door. He had already known before she reached him. The question had been asked not because he needed the information but because he needed to hear her not answer, needed to stand in the silence of her certainty for just a moment before the reality of it finished landing. He breathed out again. Slower this time. Longer. "All right then," he said. 2 words. That was all. But the way he said them, quiet and even and full of something that did not have a name but did not need one, said everything that the 2 words themselves did not. He kept his hand on her jaw. She kept her head against his. They stood there in the amber light of the corridor while the last of the gallery crowd filtered past them, and neither of them moved and neither of them spoke, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Grant had stopped walking a few steps behind Sarah when she went to Ren. He stood in the corridor and watched them for a moment. Not intruding, not announcing himself, just present the way a person is present when they have been part of something and want to see it end well before they walk away. He watched Ren's hand on Sarah's jaw. He watched the stillness of the two of them together. He thought about a burning colony and a child who could not stand and a draconian soldier who would not put him down. He thought about 12 years of everything in between. Then he turned and walked away down the corridor. Quietly. Without interrupting the moment with any kind of goodbye. Some things did not need a closing line and he was experienced enough to know which ones they were. He had almost reached the junction at the far end of the corridor when he heard footsteps behind him. Light and quick, someone younger moving to catch up. He did not slow down. The footsteps reached him and matched his pace. He looked to his left. It was a cadet. Young, barely 20, maybe younger. Short and serious-faced with the slightly wide eyes of someone who had just witnessed something they were still processing. She was still in her gallery uniform, a junior observer badge on her left shoulder. She had probably been sitting in one of the back rows. She looked like someone who had come to the tribunal expecting a routine proceeding and had not gotten what she expected. She walked beside him for a few steps without speaking. Working up to something. Grant waited. "Commander Grant," she said finally. Her voice was careful. Respectful. The voice of someone who was not sure if they were allowed to ask what they were about to ask. "Go ahead," he said. She was quiet for just a moment more. "Why did you stand up?" she asked. Grant kept walking. "It was not your case," she continued. "You were listed as an observer. You did not have the rank position to address the panel. You did not have to say anything." She paused. "Nobody would have said anything if you had just sat there. Nobody would have blamed you." She looked at him. "So why did you stand up?" Grant walked a few more steps. The corridor hummed quietly around them, the low steady sound of a space station doing what space stations do, keeping the air moving and the lights on and the people inside alive without asking for any particular acknowledgement for the effort. He thought about Sarah 4 hours into a rescue operation going back into a building that had already been marked as non-viable. He thought about the sound of a secondary structure coming down and the 12 minutes of not knowing. He thought about her walking out of the rubble with a child pressed against her chest and blood on her shoulder and the particular expression on her face that said she had already decided something and the rest of the world was simply going to have to accommodate it. He thought about Ren at 7 years old holding onto her claw in the medical bay because she was warm and she was there and she was not leaving him behind. He thought about a corridor on Station Mareth and a young man who had been given a way out and had looked at the people on the ground beside him and said no. He stopped walking. The cadet stopped beside him. Grant looked down the corridor for a moment. Then he looked at her. His voice was quiet. Not heavy with it, not performed or decorated. Just plain and honest and simple the way things are when they have been true for a long time. "A veteran doesn't stop fighting for family," he said, "just because the war is over." He held her gaze for just a second. Then he turned and walked away down the corridor and did not look back. The cadet stood where she was and watched him go. She stood there for a long time after he had disappeared around the corner, in the amber light of the corridor, with the quiet hum of the station around her. She did not move for a while. She was thinking about something. And somewhere behind her, in the warmth of the same corridor light, a draconian mother and her human son stood together without words, because after 12 years and one tribunal and a letter that had been folded and unfolded more times than anyone knew, words were not what the moment needed. The moment needed exactly what it had. The two of them. Together. Home. In a galaxy full of species who measured family by blood, by biology, by the species written on a form, humanity kept offering a different answer. Not louder. Not prouder. Just steadier. Just truer. The kind that silences a room.